The Man Who Carried Ghosts Across the Milky Way. Lincoln Maltese had been hauling freight across the Dorrigan corridor for 11 years, and in all that time he'd learned exactly two things worth knowing. First, that the universe didn't owe you a damn thing, and second, that his hamster Peppino would eat literally anything that wasn't nailed down. And a few things that were. The hamster sat in the breast pocket of Lincoln's cargo vest right now, whiskers twitching, beady black eyes scanning the docking bay of Outpost Calanera like a tiny furry general surveying a battlefield. Peppino was a Terran hamster, genuine Earth stock, not one of those gene-spliced monstrosities they bred on the colony worlds, and he had the disposition of a retired loan shark. He didn't speak, obviously, because he was a hamster, but the things he communicated through sheer audacity would have made a diplomat blush. Lincoln scratched his jaw, 3 days unshaved, which on his face looked less rugged and more man who lost a bet with a pillow, and checked the cargo manifest on his wrist screen. 68 crates of thermal insulation bound for the mining settlement on Brannock's Fissure. Standard run. Boring as church on a Tuesday. He liked boring. Boring meant nobody shot at you. Maltese. The dock's supervisor, a heavyset woman named Bruna Kedge, waved him over. She had the kind of face that suggested she'd seen every scam in the sector and had developed an allergy to all of them. You taking the corridor run tonight. That's the plan. Storm warning on the corridor. Class 4 ion shear. Advisory says delay 26 hours. Lincoln glanced at his ship, the Garza Torta, a mid-bulk freighter that looked like someone had welded 2 different ships together and then apologized to neither. She was ugly. She was slow. She was his. 26 hours docked here costs me fuel fees I can't eat. I'll thread it. Bruna shrugged. Your funeral. Oh, and there's a woman at Gate 9 asking about passage. Says she can pay partial. Got kids with her. Not a passenger vessel, Bruna. Didn't say it was. Just said she's asking. Bruna paused, something shifting behind her professional indifference. She's been asking for 3 days. Nobody's taking her. Lincoln started walking toward his ship. Peppino poked his head out of the pocket and chittered, a rapid-fire burst of hamster commentary that sounded distinctly judgmental. Don't start, Lincoln muttered. He made it 14 steps before he stopped. 3 days, with kids. He thought about the thermal insulation in his cargo hold. 68 crates of material designed to keep people from freezing to death on a rock 6 systems away. He thought about the particular stupidity of hauling warmth across the galaxy while leaving a woman and children cold on a dock. The metaphor annoyed him. It was too neat, too on the nose, and the universe wasn't that clever. But his boots were already turning toward Gate 9. She was sitting on a cargo crate with her back against the wall, one arm around a boy who couldn't have been older than 6, the other resting on the shoulder of a girl who was maybe 9. The woman herself looked like she'd been through the kind of war that doesn't make the news, the slow kind, fought in kitchens and corridors, and across years of decisions that all went sideways. She was thin. Not fashionably thin. Thin the way people get when eating becomes optional. Her hair was dark, pulled back tight, and her eyes, brown, deep, exhausted, tracked Lincoln the moment he appeared. The boy was asleep against her ribs, mouth open, one hand clutching a stuffed animal so worn it was impossible to tell what species it had originally been. The girl watched Lincoln with the flat, evaluating stare of a child who'd learned early that adults were unreliable machinery. Heard you're looking for passage, Lincoln said. The woman straightened. I can pay half now. I'll work the rest off. Cooking, cleaning, maintenance. I'm certified in atmospheric systems, Class 2. Where you headed? Anywhere that isn't here. Lincoln studied her. The bruise fading along her jaw told a story she wasn't telling. The way the girl positioned herself between her mother and the open corridor told the rest of it. He'd seen that posture before, on stray dogs, on soldiers, on people who'd spent too long watching doors. "The Garza Torta isn't built for passengers," he said. "No extra bunks, no proper galley. The head makes noises I'm not qualified to explain. And I'm running into a Class 4 storm." "I don't care about comfort," she said. "I care about distance." Peppino chose this moment to launch himself out of Lincoln's pocket, hit the deck with the grace of a dropped sock, and scurried directly toward the girl. The child's eyes went wide. The hamster sat up on his hind legs, wiggled his nose at her, then executed a surprisingly committed somersault that landed him on his back, paws in the air. The girl laughed. It was a small sound, rusty, like a hinge that hadn't moved in months, but it was real. "His name's Peppino," Lincoln said. "He's a terrible influence." "Mama," the girl whispered. The rat did a flip. "He's a hamster," Lincoln corrected gently. "And he did that on purpose to manipulate you. He's emotionally sophisticated in ways I find concerning." The woman looked at him, really looked, searching for the angle, the catch, the hidden cost. "My name is Sorrel Davin. These are my children, Thomas and Ket. Lincoln Maltese, freight hauler, part-time fool." He crouched to retrieve Peppino, who was now attempting to climb Ket's boot with the determination of a mountaineer. "I'm leaving in an hour. Storm's coming, and I'd rather be in it than waiting for it. You want passage? The offer stands. Half fare, and I'll take the atmospheric certification in trade." Sorrel's lips pressed together. "Why?" Because my ship's Atmos scrubber makes a sound like a dying accordion, and I've been pretending that's normal for 8 months." He stood, Peppino dangling indignantly from his fingers. "And because 3 days on a dock with kids is 3 days too many. That's not philosophy, that's arithmetic." She didn't cry. He respected that. She gathered her children, one duffel bag between them, and followed him to the ship. The Garza Torta groaned as she pulled away from Outpost Calanera, her hull plates singing off-key protest songs about the ion winds already starting to bite. Lincoln ran the pre-storm checks with the automatic ease of a man who'd done it 400 times, fingers moving across toggles and switches while his mind catalogued the 3 new variables aboard his ship. One atmospheric technician with a bruised jaw, one silent boy clutching a shapeless stuffed animal, and one sharp-eyed girl who was currently being led on a grand tour of the cargo hold by a hamster with delusions of authority. Peppino had somehow gotten into the tool locker. Lincoln still didn't understand how. The latch required opposable thumbs, which the hamster did not possess but apparently didn't consider relevant, and was dragging a socket wrench across the deck with the air of a museum curator presenting a masterpiece. Ket followed, fascinated. Thomas slept on a folded blanket in the corner of the cockpit, his breathing slow and deep, the kind of sleep that comes from finally being somewhere that isn't dangerous. Sorrel appeared in the cockpit doorway, wiping her hands on a rag. "Your scrubber isn't dying. The secondary filter housing is cracked. I shimmed it with sealant for now, but you'll need a replacement within 60 days. Lincoln blinked. "You diagnosed that in 20 minutes? "It took 12. The other 8 were spent convincing your hamster to stop sitting on the intake valve." "He does that. I think he likes the warm air." She almost smiled. Almost. "Thank you for this." "Don't thank me yet. Storm's going to hit in about—" The ship lurched sideways, claxons wailing as the first wave of ion shear slammed into them like a fist made of static. "Now." The next 4 hours were the kind of flying that separated the competent from the dead. Ion shear didn't kill you clean. It scrambled your navigation, fried your sensors, and turned your ship into a pinball in a corridor of electromagnetic fury. Lincoln flew by instinct and swearing, hands wrestling the yoke while the Garza Torta bucked and screamed. Sorel strapped the children into the cargo bay's emergency harnesses, then came back to the cockpit and, without being asked, took the co-pilot's seat and started monitoring the power grid. "Fluctuation on the port converter," she called, compensating. "Who the hell are you?" Lincoln shouted over the noise. "Someone who's tired of being helpless." He laughed, the kind of laugh that erupts in bad situations when the alternative is screaming. "Well, Sorel Devan, keep that converter balanced, or we're going to become a permanent part of the corridor's decoration." In the cargo bay, Peppino had somehow freed himself from the small cage Lincoln had secured him in, again, latches, thumbs, mysterious, and was perched on Thomas's shoulder like a furry co-pilot, bracing against each jolt with comically exaggerated dramatic leans. Ket, strapped in tight, watched the hamster with wide eyes as he repeatedly lost his balance, tumbled into Thomas's lap, and climbed back up with the stubbornness of a creature who refused to accept that physics applied to him. The storm passed. They survived. And when Lincoln finally unclenched his hands from the yoke, his fingers aching, he looked over at Sorel and found her staring at the view screen where the corridor opened into clear space. Stars scattered like someone had kicked over a jar of light. "First time co-piloting?" he asked. "First time anyone let me try." That sentence hit him somewhere he hadn't been paying attention to. He covered it by checking instruments that didn't need checking. "You did good. The converter thing, that was sharp." "My husband." She stopped. The words sat in the air like a dropped glass, not yet shattered. "My ex-husband. He was a pilot. I learned by watching. He didn't like me touching the controls, didn't like me touching much of anything that gave me options." Lincoln said nothing for a moment. Then, "Sounds like the kind of man who deserved to fly into a storm without a co-pilot." Sorel's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but closer than before. Brannock's Fisher was a mining settlement carved into the walls of a canyon so deep that sunlight only reached the bottom for 40 minutes a day. The rest of the time, the colony lived under industrial lamps that cast everything in a flat, honest white that made people look exactly as tired as they actually were. It was ugly. It was functional. And it had one thing Outpost Calanera didn't: a school, a clinic, and no record of Sorel Davan's ex-husband ever setting foot there. Lincoln unloaded the insulation crates, collected his payment, and sat in the Garza Torta's cockpit, staring at the departure sequence he'd already programmed. Next job was a fertilizer run to the agri-domes on Pelham 3. 40 hours there, 40 hours back. Routine. Simple. Peppino sat on the console, grooming his face with his tiny paws, radiating an energy that Lincoln could only describe as pointed. "I know," Lincoln said. The hamster paused, mid-groom, one paw frozen in the air. "I know what you're thinking." Peppino resumed grooming with an air of supreme indifference that somehow managed to be deafening. Lincoln rubbed his face. He was 43 years old. He'd been alone since Dessa, since the accident, since the funeral where he'd stood in a suit that didn't fit and promised an empty room, that he'd keep flying because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant acknowledging that he'd spent so much time hauling cargo that he'd forgotten to haul himself home before it was too late. Dessa had died waiting. Not waiting for him specifically. She'd stopped that years before the aneurysm. Waiting for the version of him that was going to stop running. That version never showed up. She died in a kitchen he barely remembered, in a home he'd furnished by wire transfer, married to a man who existed primarily as a departure schedule. That was the weight he carried, not grief. Grief would have been clean, earned, honest. What he carried was the knowledge that he'd had everything and had chosen the corridor instead. Every single time. The cargo over the kitchen, the ship over the bed, the solitude over the woman who'd asked him once, just once, sitting on that ugly green couch. Lincoln, When do I get to be the thing you come home for? He'd said something about the next run. There was always a next run. She died 3 months later. He kept running. Peppino bit his finger. Not hard. Just enough. Ow, fine. He found Sorel at the colony's intake office, filling out residency paperwork with grim speed. The motions of someone who'd done this before, arrived somewhere new, started over, tried again. Ket was drawing on a scrap of paper. Tomas was asleep on a bench, still holding the unidentifiable stuffed animal. "I've got a proposal," Lincoln said, leaning against the doorframe. Sorel didn't look up. "If it involves charity, I'll decline. It involves employment. My Atmo scrubber is held together with sealant and optimism. My ship needs a proper technician. I need a co-pilot who can handle a converter balance under pressure. Job pays standard crew rate plus quarters for 3, he glanced at the children, plus whatever Peppino steals from the galley, which is significant." She looked up. "You're offering me a crew position." "I'm offering you a crew position. On a freighter that looks like it was built by a committee that hated each other. That's a fair description of the Garza Torta, yes. With a hamster that has a criminal record. Alleged criminal record. Nothing's been proven." Sorel set down the pen. Behind her, Ket had stopped drawing and was watching with the focused intensity of a child who understood that this moment mattered. "Lincoln, I'm running from a man who considers me property. If he finds me, then he finds me too, and I'm less charming when I'm angry." She searched his face. "Why do you care?" He thought about the honest answer, the one about Dessa, about the kitchen, about years of hauling warmth to strangers while his own house went cold. But that answer was too big for a doorway conversation, so he gave her the smaller, equally true one. "Because you fixed my scrubber in 12 minutes, and the last guy I hired took 6 hours and made it worse." She laughed. It was the first real one. Full, surprised, slightly unhinged. The laugh of someone who'd forgotten the sound of her own amusement. Ket grinned. Even Tomas stirred, mumbling something in his sleep. "All right," Sorel said. "Trial run. 1 haul. If it works, we talk long-term." "Deal." Lincoln extended his hand. She shook it. Her grip was stronger than he expected. Peppino, who had somehow gotten into the intake office's filing cabinet, emerged with a rubber stamp in his mouth and deposited it on Sorel's paperwork with the solemnity of a notary. 1 haul became 5. 5 became 20. 20 became a year. The trial run ended after 6 days. Neither of them mentioned it. They just kept flying. The third run was a fertilizer haul to Pelham 3. 40 hours through dead quiet space, the kind of run where the biggest danger was boredom. Tomas discovered the ship's maintenance crawl spaces and spent hours mapping them, emerging covered in dust and grinning like he'd found buried treasure. Sorel caught him rewiring a junction box he had no business touching, and gave him a lecture that lasted exactly 90 seconds before pivoting into a tutorial on proper wire gauge selection. By the end of the run, the boy could identify 6 different connector types by touch alone. Ket was harder to reach. She watched Lincoln with the calculating patience of someone assembling a case, gathering evidence, testing hypotheses, waiting for the moment he'd prove himself to be exactly like every other adult she'd catalogued and dismissed. He didn't try to win her over. He just flew the ship, made bad jokes about the food, and let Peppino do the diplomacy. The hamster had an instinct for it. He'd sit on the nav console during Ket's watch shifts, performing increasingly elaborate grooming routines that she pretended to ignore, but clearly monitored. One morning, Lincoln found a drawing taped to the cockpit bulkhead, Peppino rendered in colored pencil, wearing a tiny captain's hat, standing on a console with one paw raised in what could only be described as a hamster salute. Ket never acknowledged making it. Lincoln never acknowledged finding it. It stayed on the bulkhead for years. The 5th run brought trouble of the humankind. They docked at Junction Halsey for resupply when a dock worker recognized Sorrel, or rather recognized the description someone had been circulating. A tall woman, dark hair, 2 children, running. The dock worker calmed someone. An hour later, a man in a clean jacket appeared at the Casa Tortas ramp, asking questions with the oily precision of someone who got paid to find people who didn't want to be found. Lincoln stepped down the ramp. "Help you?" "Looking for a woman and 2 kids. Resettlement case, her husband's concerned." "Ex-husband." The man smiled thinly. "That's a matter of perspective." "No," Lincoln said, and the temperature of his voice dropped in a way that made the man's smile fade. "It's a matter of court records. She filed. It's done. And you can tell whoever sent you that this particular cargo is spoken for, signed, sealed, and not available for rerouting. Friend, I'm just doing a job." "So am I. Mine involves a departure in 12 minutes and a complete disinterest in continuing this conversation." Lincoln took 1 step forward. Not aggressive, not threatening, just occupying space with the specific gravity of a man who'd spent 2 decades navigating things that wanted to kill him and considered a skip tracer in a clean jacket to be a relatively minor inconvenience. 12 minutes, and the man left. Lincoln went back aboard, sealed the ramp, and found Sorrel standing in the corridor with her arms crossed and her eyes wet. "I heard," she said. "Should have handled it quieter." "You handled it exactly right." She paused. "He'll send others. Then they'll get the same answer in a different tone." That night, after the kids were asleep, Sorrel told him the rest. The 3 years of incremental cruelty, the kind that doesn't leave marks where inspectors look, the isolation from friends, the financial controls that turned a partnership into a prison. The night she'd finally packed 1 bag in the dark, carried her children down a fire escape and started walking. She'd walked for 6 hours before finding a public transport terminal. Lincoln listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You walked 6 hours carrying 2 kids in the dark?" "Yes. That's the bravest damn thing I've ever heard, and I once flew a fertilizer barge through a debris field on manual." She laughed, wet and broken and real. "Those are not equivalent situations." "You're right. Yours is harder. Fertilizer doesn't fight back." The Casa Torta changed. Not structurally. She was still ugly, still slow, still made noises, but the kind of change that happens to a house when people start living in it instead of just sleeping there. Ket's drawings appeared on the walls of the cargo bay. Stars, ships, and increasingly detailed portraits of Peppino in various heroic poses. Tomas started talking more, first in whispers, then in full sentences, then in the rapid-fire questions of a 6-year-old, discovering that the universe was larger than the rooms he'd been locked in. Sorrel rebuilt the Atmo scrubber properly, then the water recycler, then the navigation backup, each repair a quiet statement about staying, and Lincoln started coming home, not to a place, to a sound. The sound of Ket arguing with Peppino about whether hamsters could technically be considered crew members for insurance purposes. The sound of Thomas asking why stars were hot. The sound of Sorrel humming in the engine room, a melody he didn't recognize, but that made the ship feel less like a vessel and more like a living thing with a heartbeat. He didn't fall in love with Sorrel the way stories describe it, suddenly, dramatically, with orchestral accompaniment. He fell the way freight falls off a badly secured pallet, slowly, then all at once, with a sound that's impossible to ignore. It happened over coffee at 0400 in the cockpit, her legs tucked under her, explaining how the secondary fuel injector worked while Peppino slept in her collar like a furry brooch. It happened when she yelled at him for taking a shortcut through the Venari debris field, and was right. It happened when Thomas called him Lynn for the first time, casually, as if it had always been his name, and something in Lincoln's chest cracked open like a door that had been painted shut. "You're staring," Sorrel said one evening, after the children were asleep, the cockpit lit only by instrument glow and starlight. I'm assessing a navigational anomaly. You're staring at me. The anomaly is you." She threw a dried ration packet at his head. He caught it. They sat in the kind of silence that doesn't need filling, and then she said very quietly, "Lincoln, I'm scared." "Of him?" "Of wanting this. Every time I've wanted something, it got taken." He turned his chair to face her. "I had a wife, Dessa. I lost her because I was always leaving. Not for anyone else, just for the next run, the next haul, the next reason not to sit still. She died, and I wasn't there. Wasn't there for years before that, if I'm honest." He paused. "I've been sitting with that for 11 years, carrying it like ballast, and I'm telling you right now, I'm done hauling ghosts. I want to haul something worth keeping." Sorrel's eyes glistened. "That's either the most romantic thing anyone said to me or the worst freight metaphor in human history. Can't it be both?" She crossed the cockpit, sat on the arm of his chair, and kissed him. It wasn't cinematic. It was awkward. She bumped his nose. He didn't know what to do with his hands, and Peppino woke up and fell out of her collar onto the console, where he landed on the thruster control and briefly caused the ship to lurch forward at 2% impulse. It was perfect. They married on Brannock's Fisher in the 40-minute window when sunlight hit the canyon floor. The ceremony was performed by a mining foreman named Reese Colburn, who was legally ordained because someone had to do funerals and the colony couldn't afford a specialist. Reese had a voice like gravel being poured into a bucket, and he read the vows with the tender solemnity of a man who'd presided over more goodbyes than beginnings and understood the difference. Thomas was the ring-bearer. He carried them on a cushion made from a folded cargo manifest, which Sorel had covered with silver fabric salvaged from a decommissioned thermal blanket. He walked the aisle, which was the cafeteria's central pathway, cleared of tables, with the careful concentration of a boy performing the most important mission of his life. Ket was the best man. She wore her cleanest flight jacket, stood beside Lincoln, and when he fumbled with his words, she handed him a piece of paper she'd prepared, just in case. He didn't use it, but knowing it was there steadied him. Peppino ate part of the bouquet, and no one stopped him, because everyone had given up on controlling him years ago. He also knocked over Reese's reading podium during the vows by tunneling under the fabric drape, emerging at speed, and colliding with the base in a way that suggested either calculated mischief or a fundamental misunderstanding of structural engineering. Reese didn't miss a beat, continuing to read while picking up the scattered papers. "Seen worse at funerals," he muttered. "Bruna Kedge came somehow. Flew 9 hours from Calanera on a cargo shuttle she definitely wasn't authorized to use. I've been watching your manifests," she told Lincoln at the reception, which was held in the colony's cafeteria with decorations Ket had made from packing material and wire she'd bent into shapes that were either stars or very ambitious geometric accidents. "You've been running shorter routes, staying closer. Got reasons to come back now?" Bruna raised her glass of synthetic wine, which tasted like someone had described wine to a chemist who'd never had any, and said, "About damn time, Maltese." Sorrel wore a dress she'd sewn from thermal liner fabric. It was silver and impractical, and she looked like she'd been poured from starlight. Lincoln wore the only clean shirt he owned, and boots he'd polished for the first time in their existence. The boots gleamed with the confused energy of objects encountering maintenance for the first time and not knowing how to feel about it. When he said his vows, his voice cracked on the word "stay," and Sorel squeezed his hand hard enough to leave marks. "I spent 11 years running," he said, not caring who heard. "And I just realized I wasn't running from anything. I was running from everyone who mattered. So here's my vow. I'll be the man who stays, not because I'm brave, because I'm finally tired enough to stop being stupid." Sorrel laughed through tears. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said." The competition was low. A year later, their son was born. They named him Desano. Dessa folded into it, a name for a ghost carried forward into something living. The baby had Sorel's dark eyes and Lincoln's stubborn chin, and Peppino regarded him with the suspicious fascination of a creature who couldn't quite determine whether this new, noisy organism was friend or competition. The Garza Torta grew again. Lincoln converted the secondary cargo bay into a proper living quarters. Ket, now 12, started learning navigation. Tomas, 8, developed an obsessive interest in engines and spent hours in the crawl spaces with Sorrel, learning the ship's anatomy by touch. Desano crawled, then walked, then ran, chasing Peppino through corridors while the hamster led him on elaborate detours that always ended near wherever Sorel happened to be working. Because Peppino, for all his chaos, had an unerring instinct for returning things to where they belonged. Lincoln hauled freight. Sorel kept the ship alive. The children grew, and for 3 years the Garza Torta was the happiest ugly freighter in the Dorrigan corridor. The distress signal came on a Tuesday, because catastrophes, like dentist appointments, never had the decency to happen on a day you'd mentally prepared for. They were running insulation again, poetry and repetition, Lincoln thought, to a colony called Bremen Shelf, when the signal cut through their comms like a knife through tin, automated, repeating, the kind of signal that ships only broadcast when everything human about the situation had already ended. "It's the Condor Austral," Sorrel said, pulling the registry. "Colony transport. Passenger manifest shows 312 people. Families mostly. Resettlement group headed to the outer ring. How far? 4 hours at full burn. But Lincoln, the signal's coming from inside the Morrigan Fold." The Morrigan Fold was a navigational dead zone, a region of compressed gravitational interference where sensor grids turned to static and autopilot became suicide. Ships went in, sometimes they came out. The smart ones avoided it entirely. "What's a colony transport doing in the Fold?" Lincoln asked. "Storm deviation, probably. Same kind of ion shear we flew through when we met." Sorel looked at him. 312 people. He looked at the cockpit ceiling as if it might offer an alternative opinion. It didn't. "Kids, strap in. Mama, plot me a course. Peppino," he glanced at the hamster, who was sitting on the nav console chewing a wire with concerning enthusiasm. "Peppino, stop eating the ship." They hit the Fold's edge, and everything went wrong in the specific, comprehensive way that separates challenging from lethal. The gravitational lensing warped their sensor returns into abstract art. Communications dissolved into a hiss that sounded like the universe gargling. The Garza Torta's hull groaned, a sound Lincoln had never heard her make, deep and structural, the kind of noise that means a ship is asking you politely to reconsider. "Navigating blind," Lincoln said. "Sorel, I need you on manual sensor calibration. Forget the instruments. Feel the hull. You know this ship better than she knows herself. That's either trust or insanity. Marriage is both." She worked the calibrations while he flew, the two of them operating in a wordless coordination they'd built over 3 years of storms and repairs and arguments about which direction was actually up in zero gravity. In the cargo bay, Ket held Desano, the toddler laughing because toddlers find turbulence hilarious. Thomas monitored the power grid from the engineering station, his small hands steady on controls Sorel had taught him to read. 40 minutes in, they found the Condor Austral, or what was left of her. The colony transport was pinned against a gravitational shoal, a ridge of compressed space that acted like a reef, holding the ship in place while the Fold's interference slowly crushed her hull. The bow was crumpled. Atmosphere was venting from 3 breaches. Running lights flickered in patterns that meant power failure in every language that mattered. "I'm reading life signs. Sorel said, voice tight, concentrated in the aft sections. They've sealed the forward compartments, but the structural integrity... Lincoln, that ship is coming apart. How long? Hours, maybe less if the fold shifts. 312 people, families, kids, in a ship being squeezed like a tin can in a fist. Lincoln opened the comm. Nothing but static. He boosted the signal, rerouted through the emergency array, and tried again. Condor Austral, this is the freighter Garza Torta, Lincoln Maltese, master and owner. I'm seeing your situation. Can you receive? Static. Then broken, desperate. Receiving, this is Captain Hale Morin. Structural failure. Passengers. Can't evacuate. Docking ports are... The signal fractured. Sorel. Can we dock with her? Not at the standard ports. The crumpling took those out. But... She pulled up the Condor Austral schematics, cross-referencing with the Garza Torta's cargo bay doors. If I reconfigure our starboard cargo lock and you hold position within 2 meters of their emergency hatch on the aft quarter, 2 meters, Lincoln, in a gravitational dead zone with no sensor support, I can rig a pressurized bridge. 2 meters, in the fold, blind. Yes. How confident are you in this plan? I'm confident in you. That's not the same thing. It's close enough. He turned to the cargo bay. Ket stood in the doorway, Desano on her hip, Tomas behind her. 3 faces, 4, if you counted Pepino, who was perched on Ket's shoulder with his fur standing on end, looking for all the world like a hamster who understood exactly what was happening and disapproved. "Kids," Lincoln said, "I'm going to do something stupid." "More stupid than usual?" Ket asked. She was 12 going on 40, significantly. He looked at Sorel. "If this goes bad, it won't. If it does..." "Lincoln." She put her hand on his. "You spent 11 years running from life. Don't you dare run from this." He held position at 2.1 meters, then 2, then 1.8. The Garza Torta shuddered and complained, her hull scraping against gravitational currents like a boat in rapids. Sorel rigged the pressurized bridge, thermal liner, emergency sealant, cargo strapping, and what Lincoln was fairly certain was a shower curtain. And it held. It held because Sorel built things that held, the same way she held her children, the same way she held him, with force and precision and a refusal to let go that bordered on physics-defying. The first passengers came through, stumbling, crying, carrying children and bags and each other. Lincoln stood at the bridge and counted. 20, 40, 60. The Garza Torta wasn't built for this. She was a mid-bulk freighter with a cargo bay designed for insulation crates, not human beings. But people aren't cargo, and they packed themselves in with the efficiency of desperation, sitting on crates, holding strangers' children, making room where room didn't exist. At 137, the Condor Austral shifted. A deep, metallic groan echoed through the bridge, the transport pivoting on the gravitational shoal, pulling away from the Garza Torta. "Bridge is losing seal," Sorel shouted from the engineering station. "I can reinforce, but we need to speed up the evacuation." "How many left?" 175. Lincoln grabbed the comm. "Captain Morin, I need everyone moving, now. Not walking, running." More came. 150, 120, 80. The bridge groaned. Sealant cracked. Sorel ran to the junction point and manually held the thermal liner in place, her hands pressing against material that was trying to separate, her boots planted, her teeth clenched. At 40 remaining, the gravitational shoal shifted. The Condor Austral lurched backward. The bridge tore. Sorel was thrown sideways. Lincoln saw it happening, the gap widening. The last passengers scrambling, Sorel hanging onto the frame of the emergency hatch with one hand, while the other pressed the sealant patch that was the only thing between the bridge and vacuum. "Sorel! Get them through!" She screamed, "Don't stop!" 29, 22, 15. Each one running through a bridge that was disintegrating. Sorrel holding the seal with her body, her arms shaking. The cold of near vacuum biting through the liner. 8, 4, 2. Captain Halle Moran came through last, carrying an infant that wasn't hers. She grabbed Sorrel's arm and pulled. Sorrel let go of the seal and they both fell into the Garza Torta's cargo bay as Lincoln slammed the emergency hatch and the bridge exploded outward into the folds dark. 312 people, all of them. Sorrel lay on the deck, breathing hard, her hands blistered and raw. Peppino appeared from somewhere, possibly from inside a terrified passenger's jacket, and sat on her chest, grooming his whiskers as if nothing unusual had happened. Lincoln knelt beside her. "You held a pressurized bridge together with your bare hands. I held it with sealant and stubbornness." She looked up at him. "I told you it wouldn't go bad. It almost went very bad. Almost doesn't count." He kissed her forehead, which tasted like thermal compound and fear. Around them, 312 people sat in a cargo bay designed for 68 crates, and the Garza Torta, slow, ugly, held together by repairs and love, and a hamster's inexplicable blessing, groaned under the weight and flew on. They limped out of the Morrigan Fold 4 hours later. 3 rescue vessels were waiting at the boundary, dispatched after the Condor Austral's initial distress beacon had propagated through normal space. The passengers were transferred. Captain Moran shook Lincoln's hand with both of hers and said words he'd forget and a look he never would. The Garza Torta was damaged, hull stress fractures, cargo bay doors warped, atmo scrubber destroyed, properly this time, not just the filter housing. Sorrel's hands were wrapped in burn gel. Ket was asleep in the cockpit chair, Desano curled against her. Thomas sat in the engineering crawl space, quietly inventorying what still worked. "She's hurt," Sorrel said, meaning the ship. "She'll heal," Lincoln said. "We'll dock at Brannock. Bruno will yell at me. I'll fix what I can. You'll fix what I can't. And then we keep going." Sorrel leaned against him. "Lincoln, yeah, you stayed." He understood what she meant. Not just today, though today was part of it. She meant all of it. Every run he'd taken that ended with him coming back. Every storm he'd flown into and out of. Every morning he'd woken up in the same bed on the same ship with the same woman and hadn't reached for the departure sequence. "I stayed," he said. "Turns out it's the hardest run I've ever made, and the only one worth making." Peppino, who had somehow gotten into the emergency medical kit and was wearing a self-adhesive bandage across his back like a cape, scurried across the console and deposited a single raisin in Lincoln's hand. Where the raisin had come from was unknowable. The hamster's supply chains were beyond mortal comprehension. Lincoln ate the raisin. It was stale. It was the best thing he'd ever tasted. Years later, enough years that Ket was a navigator on her own ship, and Tomas was an engineer whose hands knew the Garza Torta the way a pianist knows keys, and Desano was a teenager who'd inherited his mother's competence and his father's talent for making exactly the wrong joke at exactly the right time. Lincoln sat in the cockpit at 0400, the same hour he'd always loved, when the stars were quiet and the ship hummed her low, familiar song. Peppino was old now. Impossibly old for a hamster. 7 years, 8, who knew? Hamsters weren't supposed to last this long. But Peppino had never been particularly interested in what he was supposed to do. He sat in Lincoln's breast pocket, the same pocket he'd always occupied, smaller and slower, but still radiating that specific hamster energy of absolute, unjustifiable confidence. Sorrel was asleep in their quarters. Lincoln could hear her breathing through the open door, steady, safe, present, the sound he'd spent 11 years not knowing he needed. Some nights she still woke at 0300 and checked the hatch locks, one by one, before she could fall back asleep. She never talked about it. He never asked. He just lay awake and listened to her boots on the deck plates until she came back to bed. Some doors, once watched, never stopped being watched. He thought about Dessa. He still did, sometimes, not with the crushing guilt that had driven him for so long, but with a sadness that had weathered into something gentler. He couldn't fix what he'd done. He couldn't give Dessa back the years he'd stolen by leaving, but he could, and had, built something from the wreckage. Not a replacement, a consequence. The life he should have lived late, but lived fully, with a woman who taught him that staying was the bravest thing a runner could do. The message he'd carried to his grave wasn't complicated. A man can endure his own pain for a lifetime, swallow it, haul it, bury it under runs and routes and the comfortable anonymity of motion. But the quiet, corrosive regret of not having lived, really lived, with hands open and feet planted, that's the weight that breaks you, not what happened. What you never let happen. He'd almost been that man, the ghost who carried ghosts across the galaxy, touching nothing, holding no one, arriving everywhere and belonging nowhere. Instead, he was here, in a cockpit that smelled faintly of engine grease and the dried chamomile Sorel kept in a jar by the nav station, with a hamster in his pocket and a family sleeping behind him, and a ship that had carried 312 strangers to safety because one woman held a bridge together with her bare hands and one man finally stopped running. Peppino shifted in the pocket, settling deeper, his tiny heartbeat a pulse against Lincoln's chest. "Yeah," Lincoln said quietly, to the hamster, to the stars, to the ghost of a woman on an ugly green couch who'd asked him when she'd get to be the thing he came home for. "I know. I'm here." And sometimes on the bad nights, the ones where the fold crept back into his dreams and the bridge tore before everyone made it through, he'd find himself halfway to the cockpit, fingers reaching for the departure sequence before his hand stopped on its own. Not because he was cured of running, because running had a cost he'd already paid once, and the receipt was a name folded into his youngest son's. The Garza Torta flew on, slow and ugly and full of life, carrying warmth through the dark toward wherever they were needed next.
He hauled the coat across the velvet black, running from a ghost he couldn't put back. A broken ship, a heavy mind, leaving every piece of yesterday behind, until a fragile crew stepped on the floor. A fleeing mother and a rodent demanding more. We praise the anchor, we condemn the sail, we call it bravery when the engines fail. But what if staying isn't standing tall? What if building a home is just building a wall? They patched the vents, they patched his hollow chest. The broken pieces finally found some rest. Then came the signal from the gravity grave. Hundreds of strangers they decided to save. She held the breach with bruised and bleeding hands, drawing a line where the dark expands. We praise the anchor, we condemn the sail, we call it bravery when the engines fail. But what if staying isn't standing tall? What if building a home is just building a wall? out a heavy-breathing prize. He thought he saw redemption in their eyes. He swore he stopped the run and swore he changed his tune. But look at the shadows dancing on the moon. You didn't stop running from the guilt you owe. You just found a better hiding place below. We don't save the drowning to give them breath. We use their living bodies to hide from our own death. So lock the doors and call it love. It's just a warmer escape from the stars above.